So clinical research is of vital importance across the country in all aspects of medical field, because the only progress we've made in medicine stems from clinical research trials. Enrolling patients in clinical trials is helpful in modifying certain drugs that we already have on the market, or finding new therapy that can impact disease and certainly impact health and quality and length of life. Clinical research for me has been a passion. I mean, when I came here in 1998, I started doing clinical research within a couple of years. And so I've had a long history of clinical research at Wilmington Health. For me, it is so rewarding to see our patients come through the system, and what we find is that many of our patients that go in one research study want to go in another one, whether it's in my disease state or go be one in cardiology and diabetes. I think what I've found is that many of our patients tend to have better outcomes, better healthcare scores, and tend to be quite happy because they love working with our clinical research staff. We have our research staff at PMG, in which we bring patients in, and we're able to see those patients frequently, more often than they get seen through a regular traditional route. And so I think that not only driving down the costs to the community locally through keeping them out of the hospital, but I think it drives down across the country, because we're not costing the industry a lot of pharmaceutical. It's being paid through clinical research. So for me, that's been very important. I think patients experience the positive experience they have by being in a clinical research trial. In terms of how it affects our practice, probably about 20% of my time is spent doing clinical research and enrolling a large number of patients in both pulmonary fibrosis, COPD, asthma, sleep medicine. Many of these patients are offered therapy that they can't afford otherwise, because some of this therapy is investigational, some of it's already on the market that they may not be able to afford. So the other thing it does is it helps patients to get in to see us more often. So instead of paying to see a pulmonary provider, they may actually get to see them for free, or maybe get their medications paid for. So they tend to be more compliant with therapy. We tend to see them more often. They tend to get sick less, actually. The patients we have in clinical research studies often do much better than the patients who come through a more traditional route. We were part of a trial a few years ago for COPD, and in which they had a medication, Spiriva, that was on the market in a certain device, and they developed a different device to use the same drug. And I used to tell my patients, you're going to get one of these two drugs and you don't know which one. You're going to use both inhalers. It's Coke in a can or Coke in a bottle, but it's still Coke. And we followed them for about 3 years, and what the FDA wanted to know was, using Coke in a bottle, was it as good as Coke in a can? And what were the side effects? Were there any other untoward effects of using this mist form versus a dry powder? And we learned a lot. We're on 16,000 patients from around the world in a study that essentially showed that there was no difference between the devices in terms of the drug being delivered. But we also were able to categorize a lot of disease states from that, things that affect them, like high blood pressure, cardiac events, other side effects that may occur. And we got a lot of epidemiological data about patients with COPD. So we enrolled a certain class of patients. And now that therapy is very standard, and it's sort of standard of care to use that other device. So now patients have a choice for how to get the drug into their lungs. And I think that has impacted a lot. How does a patient get enrolled? Some patients come through, they'll see a flyer, they get a letter that there's something available, and they'll come and I'll meet them for the first time. Most of the patients that we enroll are patients from our own clinic for the most part. And what I'll do is I'll decide when I see them whether they may actually even be a candidate for any of the 5 or 6 studies I have for a particular disease state. And then I'll offer it up to them. What I never do is try to steer somebody in any direction. I sort of open label approach in which I tell them whether there may be a placebo involved and what that may mean, or whether it's just Coke in a can or Coke in a bottle, so to speak, or whether we're comparing Coke to Pepsi, for instance, and seeing whether there's any difference between two different drugs made by two different manufacturers. And I try to give them as much information on the front end and then let them make the decision about whether it's something they'd be interested in. I usually try to couch it in terms of, this is out there, it's available, I want you to know about it. You may be doing something for the future of medicine. A good example is a pulmonary fibrosis study. We have something called a registry study, and there's no drugs involved. Essentially, we're just cataloging data on patients who may or may not be on therapy. Because not everybody with pulmonary fibrosis gets put on therapy. And we want to know what happens to those that don't get put on therapy, and then what happens to those that do. And so sometimes we just put patients in a research study just to collect data. So there may not always be a drug involved. That's really important, is that we keep our providers across our practice feel like they're part of this, because many of these are not my patients. They may be their patients. They might be both of our patients. Sometimes we're shared COPD patients, and sometimes it's just another provider's patients. So we try to, we may identify them through our electronic medical record. It's fairly easy to do a search for asthma, sleep apnea, COPD, pulmonary fibrosis through the ICD codes. But then once we do that, just because we identify them doesn't mean that, one, the patient needs to be in the study, or that their provider would want them in a study. So we try to let our providers know through flyers or education, here we have this study. If you have some, feel free to refer them. And then if they're going to be in a study, I always try to send a letter out to them, or some sort of communication to let them know that patient A is interested in the study and going to be enrolled, and then we'll try to have pop-ups through our electronic medical record to let people know that the patient is in a study.